There is a particular kind of silence that belongs only to the hour before an execution. It is not the silence of a sleeping house. It is not the silence of an empty road. It is something older and heavier than those. The silence of a crowd that has made a decision and needs the quiet to hold it together. Because the moment a single voice rises, the moment one person says aloud what several people are already thinking, the whole weight of the morning's purpose begins to shift. And the men who organized that Thursday in April of 1849 could not afford for anything to shift. They had built this morning carefully. They intended to finish it. The town had no name that history remembered clearly. It was one of those Georgia county seats that existed more as a function than a place. A courthouse, a tavern, a few merchants, a church with a bell that could be heard from the surrounding farms when the wind was right, red clay roads, Spanish moss on the old trees, the particular smell of the American South in spring, something green and wet underneath, and something else underneath that, something older and harder to name. By the time the sun had cleared the tree line, there were already more than 200 people gathered in the open ground beside the courthouse. They had come from the farms in the town and the outlying properties. Some had ridden since before sunrise. The men stood in the front, mostly arms folded or hands in pockets, wearing the expression of people attending to necessary business. Behind them, the women. And behind the women, at the very edges of the assembly, the places designated by custom and by law, where stood the people who had come not to approve but to witness. The enslaved men and women of that county, some brought by their owners, some who had asked permission and been granted it for reasons their owners could not have fully explained even to themselves. 3 wooden platforms had been built overnight from fresh pine. You could still smell the resin. 3 ropes hung from a cross beam in the windless morning air. They did not move. 3 men were brought out, not murderers, not arsonists, not men who had lifted a hand against another human being. 3 men who had done something that the landowners of that Georgia county considered more dangerous than any of those things. Something that threatened not a life, not a building, but the entire invisible architecture that held their world in place. They had learned, they had taught, and one of them, the one who walked out last, the one who had started all of it, had done something so far outside the boundaries of what that world would permit that even the men who built the platform could not agree on exactly how to describe it in the court record. They had settled in the end on a phrase that captured none of it, but was the best available language for what they feared. Deliberate and sustained subversion of the social order. His name was Elijah Calhoun. And if you want to understand what that phrase meant, if you want to understand what one man did that could bring 300 people out of their beds before sunrise on a Thursday morning to make sure it stopped, then you have to go back. You have to go back to Georgia in the 1840s, to a 1,400-acre cotton plantation 60 miles south of Macon, and to a man sitting alone in an eastern cabin with a patience that must have felt, from the inside, like the most dangerous thing he had ever carried. Before we go there, if you are new to this channel, subscribe right now and leave a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I read every single one. These stories belong to all of us. Now let's go back to where this began. Georgia in the 1840s was not simply a place. It was a system. And like all systems built on a fundamental lie, this one required constant maintenance. Every morning on every plantation in that cotton belt was a performance. A performance of normalcy, of natural order, of the idea that the people bent over those long white rows were positioned exactly where their capacity and their nature had placed them. The performance required everybody's participation. The enslaved people performed submission. The overseers performed authority, the landowners performed benevolence or at least reasonableness, and the law performed legitimacy. In 1829, the state of Georgia had codified the performance into statute. It became a criminal offense, punishable by fine, by flogging, by imprisonment, to teach any person of color, enslaved or free, to read or to write. The men who wrote that law understood something with perfect clarity, that the entire machinery of forced labor depended not on chains alone, but on a particular management of the mind. Because a man who cannot read cannot understand the contract that binds him. A man who cannot write cannot forge the past that might free him. On a man who has never been permitted to engage with the organized knowledge of the world around him is easier, far easier, to convince that the world around him is fixed, permanent, God-given, and unchangeable. The law was not cruelty, it was engineering. The county in our story sat in the deep middle of Georgia's cotton belt. The land was flat and it was merciless. In summer, the heat came down, not like weather, but like pressure. The specific, relentless pressure of a sky that had decided to make the work harder. The field stretched in every direction, cotton in long white rows running to the tree line. And the people who moved through those rows, bent at the waist, moving slowly, saying nothing. From a distance, they became nearly invisible, indistinguishable from the landscape. That was the intention. That was the design. Human beings reduced by the management of space and labor and law to features of the terrain. The Hargrove Plantation occupied nearly 1,400 acres of that terrain. Colonel Nathaniel Hargrove was a third-generation Georgia landowner, a man who had inherited the property from his father and expanded it aggressively, buying adjacent parcels, clearing additional acreage, running more and more cotton to the Macon factor each season. He kept 63 enslaved people on the property, men, women, children, in a long row of cabins at the eastern end of the land, far enough from the main house that the smoke of their evening fires blurred into the tree line before it reached Hargrove's veranda. The main house was white-columned and large without being ostentatious. Hargrove considered ostentation a form of insecurity. He was a measured man, not generous but not gratuitously cruel. He fed the people on his property adequately. He did not hire overseers with reputations for recreational violence. He allowed small gardens behind the cabins, and on Sunday afternoons permitted people to gather without close supervision, which he considered a reasonable concession and which cost him nothing he valued. His wife, Mrs. Dorothea Hargrove, was a narrow-faced woman of 42 who moved through the house with the quiet precision of someone who had long ago accepted that her intelligence exceeded what her world required of her and had made a private peace with that fact that was not peace at all, but rather a very controlled and very private war. She read, she gardened. She managed the household accounts with a thoroughness that embarrassed her husband's bookkeeper. She observed things without announcing the observation, and she filed away what she observed with the methodical patience of a woman who had learned that the only safe place for her knowledge was inside her own mind. Their son Clement had recently returned from a college in Savannah with a degree in classical literature and an enthusiasm for Stoic philosophy that manifested at the dinner table in a way his father found moderately insufferable. He was 20 years old. He was not unkind. He was simply, in the particular way of young men educated above their circumstances, utterly unequipped for the world he had been born into. And then there was the man in the eastern cabin. His name was Elijah Calhoun, and he had been on the Hargrove property for 4 years when our story begins in earnest in the autumn of 1843. He was 31 years old. He was of medium height, lean, with the kind of face that gave very little away, not because there was nothing behind it, But because he had spent his entire adult life learning that a face that reveals too much is a liability, he had arrived at the Hargrove Plantation as part of a lot of 4 men, purchased from a trader out of Augusta. He had said nothing during the sale or the journey or the first weeks on the property that would distinguish him from anyone else. He worked. He was reliable. He caused no difficulty. But there were things about him that a careful observer would eventually notice. The first was his hands. They were long-fingered and deliberate, the hands of a man accustomed to the precision work, though he was assigned to field labor and tool repair. When he fixed something, he studied it first. He turned it slowly in those hands, tilting it in the light, understanding the problem before he touched it. Other men hammered and pried and forced. Elijah examined and then moved once correctly. The second was his stillness when he listened. Most people fidget when they listen. They shift weight, adjust clothing, scratch at nothing. Elijah went entirely motionless, his whole body redirected into the act of paying attention, as if listening, for him, was a form of work that required the same discipline as anything else. But the thing that certain people on the Hargrove property began to notice, slowly, privately, and without saying it directly, was something that happened on the mornings when the overseer, a man named Josiah Webb, read the weekly work assignments aloud from a sheet of paper. Webb was a slow reader. He moved his lips. He paused at long words. And Elijah's eyes, if you were positioned to see them, tracked across that page from left to right, following the lines, reading a full sentence ahead of Webb's labored voice. He never reacted, never smiled, never nodded. His face showed nothing, but his eyes moved. And the people close enough to see them knew exactly what it meant. What they did not know, what no one on that plantation knew in the autumn of 1843, was the full depth of what Elijah Calhoun carried. Because the ability to follow a work assignment sheet was the surface of it, while the smallest visible fraction of something that had been built over more than 2 decades in secret, through a series of encounters and decisions and acts of extraordinary will that had cost him, at every stage, something he could not afford to lose and had paid anyway. And that story, the story of how Elijah Calhoun became who he was, is where you have to begin. Because what he did on that Georgia plantation was not an accident. It was the result of a life spent preparing for it. And you will not fully understand the Thursday morning in April of 1849 until you understand the Tuesday night in September of 1843 when it all began. But before that, you need to understand the beginning, the very beginning. Elijah was born in Savannah in 1812, the child of a woman named Bess. Bess was a house servant on a Savannah plantation. She was not a woman given to sentiment. She had learned early that sentiment was a luxury available only to people whose circumstances left room for it, and her circumstances never had. What she possessed instead was a quality of observation so precise and so patient that it functioned, in practical terms, like a form of foresight. She watched people. She watched situations. She watched her son. And what she saw in Elijah from the time he was very small was something she had no word for, but understood completely. It was a quality of attention, an intensity of absorption when he encountered something new that was distinct from the curiosity of ordinary childhood. He did not simply notice things. He metabolized them. A new sound, a new object, a new sequence of events. He would go quiet in a particular way, and you could almost see the thing being incorporated, filed, connected to everything else he already carried. When Elijah was 8 years old, Bess made a decision that required everything she had. She arranged through a chain of favors and careful conversation that took 3 months to construct for Elijah to be given work in the main house rather than assigned to the fields when the time came for him to begin working. This required the cooperation of another house servant who had the ear of the plantation mistress. It required patience and precision and the willingness to spend accumulated social capital that Bess had been carefully building for years. She spent it without hesitation. In the main house, Elijah learned something more valuable than anything that would come later. He learned to be invisible, not physically invisible, for invisible in the way that skilled house servants learn to be, present in a room without registering in the consciousness of the room's occupants. Moving through space that was full of private conversation, private correspondence, private transaction, as though he were a piece of furniture that happened to move. He poured water and cleared plates and stood near doorways and existed in the awareness of the white people in those rooms as a negative space. And in that negative space, he began to learn. The man who owned that Savannah plantation was a minister named Reverend Josiah Proctor. He was a complicated man in the way that many people with genuine convictions are complicated. His faith was real, his self-deception was also real, and they coexisted in him with a comfort that required a great deal of careful not looking. He taught Sunday Bible classes in the yard because he believed sincerely that the souls of the people he owned were worth saving, and he did not appear to notice the contradiction between that belief and the fact of their ownership. He read aloud. He was a man who thought with his voice, and an 8-year-old boy standing near the doorway of the study, hearing the same passages week after week, began quietly, incrementally, the way water finds cracks in stone, to decode the relationship between the sounds Proctor made and the marks on the pages that produced them. By the time Elijah was 12, he could read the Bible from cover to cover. He told no one. He practiced in the only way available to him, in his head in the dark, replaying the shapes of words against the sounds he knew they made, testing himself against the fragments of print he encountered in the course of a day. A label, a broadside tacked to a fence post, the name on a building. He read everything he could find without appearing to read anything at all. But what happened next changed the entire trajectory of what Elijah would become. When Elijah was 16, a traveling school teacher from Philadelphia named Mr. Amos Whitfield arrived at the Proctor plantation to spend 3 weeks giving lessons to the Proctor children. Whitfield was a Quaker, which meant he carried with him a set of convictions about the equality of human souls that were not merely theoretical. He was also, as a teacher, genuinely gifted, precise, demanding, systematic, the kind of educator who considers it a failure to allow a capable student to coast. He noticed Elijah on the second day, and he did not announce what he intended. He did not create a scene. What he did was simple and deliberate. After the formal lessons with the Proctor children were finished, he began leaving his books open on the garden table when he stepped away. He left them open to specific pages with clear structure, mathematical progressions, grammatical examples. He left them for exactly 1 hour. He did this twice. On the third occasion, he did not step away. He remained at the table. And when Elijah appeared and saw the books and saw the teacher sitting there, watching him without alarm, the two of them existed in a moment of mutual recognition that required no ceremony. Whitfield said, "You already know how to read." It was not a question. Elijah was silent for a long moment. The garden was still and hot. Somewhere beyond the hedge, the two field hands were talking, their voices carrying faintly and then dissolving. "I can follow the words," Elijah said carefully. Whitfield studied him. "Can you write?" "Some." Whitfield was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Sit down. We have 2 weeks." What followed across those 2 weeks was the most rigorous and concentrated private education that Garden had ever witnessed. Whitefield was not a gentle teacher. He believed, and said so, that gentleness was sometimes a form of condescension, the decision to hold a student at a comfortable level rather than pushing them to the place where real learning happened. He taught Elijah formal grammar, not as a collection of rules, but as the structure of thought itself. He taught him arithmetic and moved through it fast. Addition, subtraction, multiplication, long division, fractions, drilling until the operations became reflexive. He taught him basic rhetoric, how an argument is built from a claim, how a claim requires evidence, how evidence is evaluated. He taught him to write in a controlled, measured hand that could pass, if necessary, for the correspondence of a literate white man. And on the last evening of the second week, when Whitefield was preparing to leave for Philadelphia, he sat across from Elijah in the garden and said something that Elijah would carry for the rest of his life. "You understand that what is in your mind now cannot be taken from you," Whitefield said. "They can sell you. They can move you. They can do what they will with your body. But what you know, that belongs to you, completely, forever." Elijah looked at him. "Do not waste it," Whitefield said. Then he was gone, and then Elijah was alone with everything he had been given. He spent the next 15 years being careful. He was sold twice, once at 19, once at 26. The ordinary brutal arithmetic of a system that treated human beings as transferable assets. Each sale was a rupture, a loss of connection, a dispersal of everything he had quietly built. He said nothing at any of these junctures about what he knew. He worked. He was reliable. He caused no difficulty. And in the spaces between the requirements of his days, he maintained his education the way a man maintains a fire in a dangerous place, carefully with minimal fuel, making sure the light never became visible from outside. He read discarded newspapers when they blew against fences. He read the labels on medicine bottles. He read the names carved into headstones when work parties passed cemeteries. He read the documents the white men around him handled carelessly, assuming no one nearby could decipher them. He read everything that passed within his range, and he retained all of it, cataloging it in the extraordinary archive of a mind that had been trained to hold what it received. He did arithmetic in his head during long stretches of field work. He composed sentences in the structure Whitefield had taught him, revising them silently, testing their logic. He thought about rhetoric, about argument, about how a position is defended, about what constitutes evidence and what constitutes assumption. He had no one to discuss any of this with. He conducted the conversation in both directions himself, arguing positions and refuting them, in an entire intellectual life conducted entirely within the boundaries of his own mind, invisible to everyone around him. By the time he arrived at the Hargrove Plantation in 1839, Elijah Calhoun had accumulated more genuine education than most white men in that county would ever possess. He had the equivalent, in practical terms, of what a careful student might receive at a modest secondary school, and in some disciplines, considerably more, because he had been taught by someone who believed in the full development of capable minds and had not withheld anything on the assumption that this particular student could only go so far. He knew all of this. He sat with all of it in the eastern cabin every evening, and he waited. For what exactly he could not have said precisely, but something in him had begun by the autumn of 1843. Ere to stop being content with waiting. Something had shifted quietly without announcement in the deep interior of a man who had been patient for a very long time. And then a ledger appeared on a desk, and everything changed. The autumn of 1843, late September. The cotton had been picked and ginned, and the accounts for the season were due to the Macon factor. Hargrove's bookkeeper, a free white man named Percival Oates, who rode out from town twice monthly, had fallen ill with a fever and missed 3 consecutive visits. The accounts were backing up. Cotton weights recorded incorrectly. Bale prices entered in the wrong columns. Totals that did not total. Then Hargrove's son, Clement, had been handed the ledger and had made everything worse, adding error to error with the confident incompetence of a young man who did not know enough to know what he did not know. Hargrove threw the ledger across the study on a Wednesday afternoon. It landed on the floor near the writing desk where his wife Dorothea was sitting, reviewing household correspondence. She looked at the ledger on the floor. She looked at her husband. She looked at her son, who had turned red to the hairline. Then she folded her hands in her lap and said, with the precise quietness of a woman who has been observing something for months and has finally decided the observation is worth sharing, "There is a man in the eastern cabin who I believe can help." Hargrove looked at her. "His name is Elijah," she said, "but I have noticed things." She did not elaborate. Dorothea never elaborated. She simply held the colonel's gaze until the silence made the elaboration unnecessary, and then she returned to her correspondence. Hargrove sent for Elijah that afternoon. Elijah walked from the eastern cabin to the main house in the October heat and stood in the doorway of the study, reading the room in the 2 seconds before anyone spoke to him. The open ledger on the desk, the colonel's expression, a proud man in need of something he did not want to ask for, the son in the corner, avoiding eye contact, and Mrs. Dorothea at the writing desk, perfectly still, watching him with the particular attention of a woman who has known something for a while and is now waiting to see if she was right. "Can you read?" Hargrove asked. The question sat in the air between them. Elijah took one beat, precisely one. The beat of a man making a decision he had been moving toward for a long time and had now reached. "I can try, sir," he said. He sat at the desk. He opened the ledger. He did not perform confusion. He did not scan the page with artificial slowness to make the colonel comfortable. He read it in silence, moving efficiently through 6 pages of tangled figures. And then he picked up the pen and in clean and careful script, began to correct every error on every page. The room was completely silent while he worked. When he finished, he set the pen down. He folded his hands on the desk. And he said, without drama, in the same calm voice he had used every day of his adult life, "The discrepancy is in the July account, sir. Then the bale weight was recorded at 412 pounds, but the price reflects 420. The difference carries forward through 3 subsequent entries and accounts for the shortfall in the September total." He indicated the relevant column with one finger. Hargrove stared at the page for a long time. He stared at Elijah. He stared at Clement. Then he looked back at the page, at the clean corrections written in a hand more careful than his own bookkeeper's. He said nothing for nearly a full minute. Then, "How long have you been able to do this?" Elijah met his gaze. "A while, sir." That was all. Hargrove was quiet for another moment. Then he dismissed Elijah with a gesture and stood at the window looking out at the eastern fields for a long time after he had gone. Mrs. Dorothea, at her writing desk, permitted herself the smallest possible expression of satisfaction and then returned to her letter as if nothing unusual had occurred. But what had occurred was unusual, and the word, because word always moves, was already moving. On a plantation, information does not travel the way it travels in a town. There are no newspapers, no social calls, no casual conversations at the general store. Information on a plantation travels through the quality of a glance across a yard, through what is withheld from a sentence rather than said in it. Through the way a man walks back to his cabin after something has happened, the particular angle of his shoulders, the pace of his steps. By the time Elijah reached the eastern cabin that evening, 3 people were watching for him. By the time he sat down outside with a piece of wood in his hands, whittling, his customary way of giving his hands something to do while his mind worked, 6 people had found reasons to be nearby. Nobody asked him directly. That was not how it worked. The first person to say anything was a woman named Naomi, who had been on the Hargrove property for 11 years and who ran the kitchen with a competence so thorough that even Webb, the overseer, was careful about how he spoke to her. She was 43 years old. She had a face that had taken in a great deal and given back very little. She sat beside Elijah in the cooling evening air. Neither of them spoke for a while. "Word is you sat at the colonel's desk," she said finally. Elijah kept whittling. "Word is you wrote in his ledger." Still nothing from Elijah. Naomi was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're going to have to decide something." "What's that?" "What you do with it. Now that he knows." She paused. "Because it won't stay just him knowing. These things never do." Elijah stopped whittling. He looked at the piece of wood in his hands for a moment. Then he said quietly, "Hargrove won't tell anyone. It would reflect on him, having a man like me on his property and not knowing." "It's not Hargrove I'm thinking about," Naomi said. She stood, smoothed her apron, and walked back toward the kitchen without another word. Elijah sat with the wood in his hands and the darkening sky overhead and understood exactly what she meant. It was never the man at the top of the structure you had to worry about. The man at the top had something to protect and understood the value of discretion. It was the men in the middle, the overseers, the neighbors, the farmers at the tavern who had organized their entire sense of themselves around the idea that certain lines did not move. Those were the men who would come if they heard, and they would hear. Eventually, they always heard. He sat with that knowledge and the piece of wood in his hands, and the thing inside him that had been patient for so long continued its slow transformation into something that patience could no longer contain. He made his decision before he went to sleep that night. He did not tell anyone. He simply made it in the quiet of the eastern cabin, lying on his back in the dark, and it settled into him with the finality of something that has been a long time coming. He started teaching on a Tuesday night in September of 1843, and it began the way all truly consequential things begin. Not with ceremony, not with plan, but with a single small question asked by someone who had nothing yet to lose. The young man's name was Thomas. He was 18 years old, newly arrived from a farm near Athens. Small and quick-eyed, with the particular alertness of a person still in the early stages of understanding exactly where he had landed. He had been at the Hargrove property for 3 weeks. He sat beside Elijah one evening after the day's work and asked, with the directness of someone who did not yet know the full weight of what he was asking, "Can you teach me to write my name?" Elijah looked at him. Then he leaned forward and smoothed a patch of earth beside the cabin step with the flat of his hand. He picked up a small stick. He wrote, Thomas. And Thomas stared at the letters in the dirt. He went very still. Not the trained stillness of a man managing his reactions, but the natural stillness of someone who has encountered something they did not know they were waiting for. His jaw tightened. His eyes went bright in a way that was almost painful to witness. He reached out slowly and touched the letters with his fingertip, tracing each one from left to right as if they might dissolve if he pressed too hard. "That's me," he said, very quietly, barely above a whisper. "That's your name," Elijah said. "It's different from you, but it's yours." Thomas looked up. "Can I learn the rest?" Elijah looked at the dark fields. at the windows of the main house with their yellow lamplight, at the sky overhead. He was quiet for a moment that felt long to Thomas and probably was not long at all to Elijah, who was doing in that moment the kind of calculation that takes place not in the mind, but in the whole body. Then he said, "Come back tomorrow night and bring Silas." Within 2 weeks, there were 7 people gathering in the eastern cabin in the hour between the end of the day's work and the time when Webb made his final rounds. By the end of the 3rd week, there were 11. They came quietly, 1 or 2 at a time, entering the cabin without ceremony and sitting close together in whatever light was available. A thin strip of moonlight through the window, sometimes nothing at all. And here's what you need to understand about those early nights, because this is the part the history books never capture. It was not simple. It was not comfortable. These were people who went to sleep exhausted every night and rose before dawn every morning and labored in a heat that ground the body down day by day. They were not coming to a comfortable classroom. They were coming to a small dark cabin after a day that had taken most of what they had, to do something that, if discovered, could cost them everything up to and including their lives. And they kept coming, every single night, without fail. Elijah taught the way he had been taught, with precision, with structure, with an absolute refusal to condescend. He began with sounds, the letters as sounds before they were symbols. He would make the sound and then show, in the dirt or scratched on a piece of bark, the mark that stood for it. Then the mark again, and the sound again, until they lived together in the mind the way paired things live, inseparable. Then words built from sounds, then meaning built from words. He drilled, he repeated, he went back over what had been covered before beginning anything new, because he understood that knowledge built on uncertain foundation is not knowledge but performance. It falls apart the moment the performance is interrupted. He wanted what he gave them to hold. Under pressure, under stress, under the conditions they actually lived in, rather than the conditions in which it would have been easy to remember. He was patient in a way that surprised even people who thought they knew him. When someone struggled, and everyone struggled at some point with something, he did not show frustration. He paused. He thought. He found another way in, another angle of approach, another analogy that made the thing visible from a different direction. He had noticed in his years of solitary study that understanding rarely arrives by the front door. It sneaks in from the side when you have stopped waiting for it. His job as a teacher was to build enough doors that it could find a way through. What happened in that eastern cabin over those nights was not just education. It was something else, something that the people inside it felt clearly, but struggled to name in the moment. Naomi came to the 3rd gathering, sat in the corner, and watched for the entire hour without participating. At the end, she rose and left without speaking, but she came back the next night, and the night after that, and the night after that. By the 2nd week, she was helping, taking the newer students aside while Elijah worked with the more advanced ones, drilling sounds with a patience that mirrored his own. Thomas found the words for it one evening, walking back to his cabin in the dark after the lesson had ended. He was not speaking to anyone in particular. He was simply thinking aloud, the way a person does when something has rearranged something inside them, and they need to hear it from outside to make it real. "It feels like church," he said, "but for your mind." That was exactly what it was. And none of them, not Elijah, not Thomas, not Naomi, could have known in those September evenings how far the thing they were building was going to reach. Because what was about to happen next was something that nobody on that property and very few people in that county could have predicted. And it began with a white woman crossing a fence in the dark. Miss Eleanor Sutton was 24 years old, and she was, by the standards of her world, everything she was supposed to be. She was the third daughter of the neighboring Sutton family. She had been educated at a female academy in Augusta for 4 years, which had given her adequate reading, acceptable correspondence, basic arithmetic, parlor piano, scripture, and the social graces appropriate to her station. She could carry a conversation in polite company. She could manage a household. She could produce the kind of decorative needlework that was displayed on parlor walls as evidence of female accomplishment. She was, in all the ways that her world measured such things, complete. The problem was that Eleanor Sutton knew the difference between complete and full. And for 24 years, she had been complete without being full. She had read what was placed in front of her and hungered for what was not. She had listened at the edges of conversations between men about history, politics, mathematics, law. Conversations she was not invited into, not because her intelligence was insufficient, but because her sex made her participation decorative at best and improper at worst. She had watched her brother come home from his university in Athens talking about Aristotle and Euclid and the principles of rhetoric with a reverence that made her want to put her fist through the parlor wall. She had sat in that parlor in the evenings and read her Bible and her approved texts and her borrowed novels and felt, underneath all of it, the particular frustration of a mind that is being fed on schedule when it is hungry all the time. The word about Elijah reached her through her family's house servant, a woman named Hattie who was connected through the dense invisible web of relationship that linked enslaved people across that county to people at the Hargrove property. What Hattie described was not the version that would have been told among white people. She did not describe a curiosity or a novelty. She described, in the careful, indirect language of someone who has learned to speak around the thing rather than at it, a man who could teach, not just letters and sums, but history, mathematics, the kind of deep textual reading that Eleanor's brother had come home from Athens describing with such reverence. Eleanor sat with that information for 3 weeks. She turned it over. She examined it from every direction. She thought about what it would mean to ask. She thought about what it would mean to go. She thought about what the county would say if it became known. And she thought about what she would be if she did not go. What she would be in 10 years and 20 if she continued to fill her days with the same narrow accomplishments she had been given. And when she had finished thinking, she sent Hattie with a message. The message was precise and careful. It asked for a meeting at a time and place convenient to the recipient. It promised discretion. It asked for the same in return. It said nothing beyond what was necessary. Elijah received it on a Wednesday afternoon. He read it twice, not because he needed to, but because he was thinking about what it meant and what it could become and what it would cost. He sent back 4 words: Friday, East Fence, 8. He told no one. Eleanor came on Friday evening, dressed in dark colors with no jewelry, having told her family she was unwell and retiring early. She came on foot, through the back of the Sutton property, across the scrub field that separated the 2 plantations, to the east fence where Elijah was waiting in the thin moonlight. They looked at each other for a moment without speaking. Both of them were doing the same thing, reading the other person in the way that people read a situation when it matters. Then Elijah said, "What do you want to learn?" He asked it simply, the way he asked everyone, as if the answer were the most important thing in the room, which it was. Eleanor did not hesitate. She said, "Mathematics, past arithmetic, rhetoric, and history. Real history, not the version we are given in approved texts." She paused. "And whatever else you think is worth knowing." He looked at her for another moment. Do you understand what you're asking me to risk? Yes, she said. Do you understand what you're asking me to risk? The question was honest. He respected it immediately. Come Saturday evening, he said. Not to the cabin. There is a place past the far barn, near the old oak at the property edge. Come alone. She came Saturday. She came the following Saturday. She came 6 consecutive Saturdays before she brought anyone else. A woman named Mrs. Caroline Marsh, 31, the wife of a small landowner from the eastern part of the county, who had been educated even more narrowly than Eleanor, and who sat down at that oak tree on her first night with the expression of someone who has been looking for a door for a very long time and has finally found one. By November of 1843, there were 4 white women attending lessons at the oak tree. They came separately by different routes, at slightly different times, and they spoke of it in public in language so oblique that a person without the key could not have decoded it. Among themselves in private, they spoke of it with an intensity that surprised them, with something close to hunger. And now here is the part of this story that almost no one, in the official version of events, was willing to name clearly. Because what those women found at the oak tree was not what any of them had expected to find. They had expected to find a remarkable man, a curiosity, an enslaved person whose circumstances had produced something unusual and instructive. They had expected to find, if they were honest, a version of education that was impressive given its origin, but not comparable in rigor to what a real institution might offer. What they found was a teacher who was better than any teacher they had ever had, better than the academy in Augusta, better than the woman who had given Eleanor piano lessons in French and approved literature for 4 years. Better, though none of them would have said this outside that circle, than the tutors their brothers had employed. Elijah taught without condescension. He assigned work and expected it completed. He asked hard questions and waited without filling the silence for hard answers. Or he corrected errors clearly, specifically, without apology or excess gentleness. When Eleanor gave him a poorly constructed argument in the 3rd week of their lessons, he looked at it carefully and then looked at her and said simply, "The claim is not supported by what you have offered. The middle step is missing. Find it." She went home that night and worked at it for 2 hours and came back the following week with something better. And Elijah looked at the revised argument and said, "Now it holds." The experience of being held to a standard she had never been given, the experience of failing and being told plainly that she had failed, and then reaching the thing she had failed at, was unlike anything Eleanor Sutton had encountered in 24 years of approved female education. It was not comfortable. It was not pleasant. But it was real, in a way that almost nothing else in her daily life was real, and she went back to it every week with the single-mindedness of a person who has found the thing they were looking for. Mrs. Marsh brought a friend in November. The friend brought her sister in December. By January of 1844, the circle at the oak tree had grown to 6. And the circle in the eastern cabin had grown to 16. And Elijah Calhoun was managing, in that Georgia winter, something that had never been managed in that county before. An education that crossed every line that Georgia law and Georgia custom had drawn, with the specific intention of making such crossings impossible. He was doing it through precision and calm, and the authority of a man who does not need anyone's permission to know what he knows. He was doing it in the dark, one in stolen hours, at terrible personal risk, with a patience and a seriousness of purpose that had been building in him since a garden in Savannah 20 years before. And the people he taught were changing, not visibly, not in ways that could be reported or pointed to, but in the particular quality of their presence in the world. Thomas carried himself differently, not proudly in a way that would draw attention, but with a subtle interior solidity that had not been there before. The knowledge that his name existed in writing, that the world contained a mark that was specifically and permanently his, had done something to the way he occupied space. Naomi had begun, quietly and without announcement, keeping mental account of the cotton weights recorded at the gin house, cross-referencing them against what she had seen Elijah correct. 3 times over the winter, she identified discrepancies. She said nothing about this to anyone except Elijah, who nodded slowly when she told him, and said nothing, but whose eyes for a moment showed something. The knowledge was moving, like light through a window. It did not stay where you aimed it. It spread through the space around the people who carried it, changed the air they moved through, showed in their faces to those who knew how to look. One person knew how to look. His name was Josiah Webb. Webb had been an overseer for 12 years, across 3 properties. He was not an educated man. He could read adequately, write slowly, do basic arithmetic. He was not imaginative, but he was in the way of people whose entire professional survival depends on correctly reading human behavior, perceptive in a narrow and specific way. While he knew what the people on the Hargrove property were supposed to look like and feel like and move like, he had calibrated his understanding of normal against years of observation, and something had shifted. He could not name it at first. He spent 3 weeks in the late autumn of 1843 trying to locate the source of his unease before it crystallized into something specific. It was the eyes, finally. The eyes of a literate person move differently in a room with text in it than the eyes of someone who cannot read. They catch things. They register, briefly, on written information in the environment before the face can be controlled. Webb had spent enough time around educated white men to know what that quality looked like, and he was seeing traces of it in a cabin row in Georgia where no such thing was supposed to exist. And he started watching Elijah specifically. He watched him for 2 weeks, in the fields, at the gin house, near the barn, in the yard. He watched his hands. He watched his eyes. He watched the way people gathered near him in the evenings. The way those gatherings ended just slightly before Webb's rounds brought him to the eastern end of the property. The way people dispersed casually by ones and twos, as if nothing had been occurring. By December, Webb had assembled the picture. He went to Hargrove. He sat in the study and described carefully what he had observed. He did not accuse. He presented information and let the colonel read it. Hargrove heard him out without expression. When Webb finished, there was a silence. Then the colonel said that he would look into the matter and dismissed Webb with a gesture. What he did not tell Webb was that he already knew. He had known since the afternoon he watched Elijah correct the ledger. He had made a calculation at that moment. The calculation of a pragmatic man who has encountered something valuable and is deciding how to use it without breaking it. He had used Elijah's knowledge carefully and privately for months, bringing him account work that Oates handled clumsily, receiving clean results in return, and telling himself that this was a private arrangement that concerned no one else. He had not accounted for the fact that private arrangements in a society built on the enforcement of public rules do not stay private. They breathe. They expand. They develop consequences the original arrangement never intended. He sat at his desk after Webb left and stared out the window at the January fields. The land was gray and cold. The cotton was done, shipped, the money in the Savannah Bank. Everything was exactly as it was supposed to be. And underneath all of it, in the eastern cabin and at the oak tree, something was occurring that the system he had inherited and maintained and depended on had been specifically designed to prevent. He had a decision to make. He sat on it for 2 weeks. In those 2 weeks, he was not the only one deciding things. because word had traveled beyond the Hargrove fence line. The 4 women attending the oak tree lessons had been careful, but careful has a limit in a small county in 1844. A woman leaving her house alone in the evening on a Friday was noticed. A woman who returned from the direction of the Hargrove property with a look in her eyes that had not been there last season was noticed. A woman who spoke at a social gathering with references to historical events and rhetorical concepts that no academy in Augusta had put there was noticed. And the notice traveled the way all notice travels, sideways, through implication, gathering weight as it moved. By February of 1844, 3 men in the county had assembled the fragments into a picture, and the picture disturbed them with a specific structural kind of disturbance that was different from ordinary objection to a broken law. It was not simply that an enslaved man could read. That was troubling enough. It had been made illegal for precisely the reason that made it troubling, but an enslaved man who was teaching white women, who was placing himself in the intimate architecture of instruction, in the position of the authority in the room, and who was holding white women to standards, who was deciding what they were capable of and how far they could go. That was not just a violation of a statute. That was an inversion of the entire structure of the world those men had been born into and depended upon, and had never in any private or public moment questioned. The 3 men were Aldous Crane, a farmer from the north end of the county, his brother-in-law Marsh Whitfield, who operated a small mill, and Duncan Pryor, a man who had been born in that county and had never left it, and who considered himself, in the most sincere and unreflective way possible, a guardian of its customs. They were not wealthy men. They were not powerful men in the sense of holding official position, but they were willing, which in certain moments is worth more than either. They went to Hargrove first. The conversation was tense on their side and careful on Hargrove's. He denied that anything improper was occurring on his property. He said it with the flat authority of a landowner defending his right to manage his own affairs, and for a moment the authority held. They left unsatisfied. They went next to the county justice, Cornelius Aldgate, 70 years old, who had been administering law in that county since before the 1829 statute. Aldgate listened and said he would conduct an inquiry. He said it on a Thursday. On the following Tuesday evening, 3 men arrived at the Hargrove property after dark, coming not through the front gate, but through the scrub at the eastern edge. They were not part of Aldgate's inquiry. They were carrying rope. What happened next moved fast in the way that dangerous things move. Not because the people involved were reckless, but because they had prepared for it. Elijah had been warned. The warning came through the same invisible network that carried all information among the people of that county who had learned to carry it. Faster than any horse, quieter than any whisper, impossible to trace. He had spent the 3 days before the men arrived, clearing every piece of evidence from the property. Every sheet of scratched writing, every improvised primer, every notched stick used to keep count of a lesson's progress, distributed to people he trusted, dissolved into the landscape, gone. When Webb brought him to the main house yard that night, there was nothing to find. Crane spoke at length in the yard. He was a man who believed in the sound of his own conviction. He described what had occurred on the Hargrove property as an act of deliberate war against the order of things, not in anger which passes, but in the cooler and more permanent register of a man who has arrived at a conclusion and does not intend to revisit it. Elijah stood in the yard and said nothing. He had decided days before this moment that he would say nothing here, not because he had nothing to say, because he understood with absolute clarity that nothing he said could change what was going to happen, and he refused to spend his dignity on an argument with men who had stopped listening before they had begun. His face gave nothing away. Webb stood to the side, watching. He had spent 12 years reading the faces of enslaved people in dangerous situations. He had seen fear, calculation, resignation, barely concealed defiance. He had seen the full range of expressions available to a person standing in a position where the structure of the world has decided against them. He had never seen what he was seeing in Elijah's face that night, and he could not name it with the vocabulary available to him. He looked away. Hargrove said one thing during the entire confrontation. He said, "Whatever you do, it happens off my property." Then he went inside. They took Elijah off the property. They took Thomas, who had been identified through methods the records do not specify, observation perhaps, or a fragment of information from someone who eventually cracked under pressure. They took Ezekiel, 51 years old, who had learned to read at 48, to who had 3 grandchildren aged 4 and 6 and 8. The charge was violation of the 1829 statute, compounded by the invented but legally unchallenged addition of deliberate and sustained subversion of the social order. The trial took 1 day. The courtroom was full on a Friday morning in late April of 1849. Elijah sat at the front. He sat the way he always sat, with a stillness that was not submission and not defiance, but something that existed in the space between those two things that most people never find. He looked straight ahead. He did not search the room for friendly faces, though he knew they were there. He did not look for Eleanor Sutton, who was in the back of the gallery, white-faced and rigid, her hands folded in her lap in a tight knot. Thomas sat beside him, 24 years old, shaking slightly. Not from weakness, but from the specific trembling of a young body that has absorbed more fear than it was built to hold at one time. Elijah placed his hand briefly on Thomas's arm, once firmly for 4 seconds, and then withdrew it. Thomas's shaking did not stop, but it steadied. Ezekiel sat on the other side with his hands on his knees and his jaw set. He was thinking in the way people think when they have accepted what is coming and no longer need to use their mind to argue against it, about his grandchildren. He thought about the 6-year-old who had recently begun, on her own, to trace letters in the dust with her finger, mimicking something she had seen without fully understanding what it was. He thought about that finger in the dust. He thought about how that finger would keep moving after this morning, and because no one could reach inside a child and take back the motion. The verdict took 12 minutes. Justice Aldgate pronounced the sentence in a voice that the Reverend Absalom Pike, sitting in the gallery and recording everything in his private journal, later described as showing something he could only call fatigue. Not hesitation, not remorse exactly. Fatigue, the expression of an old man who has lived long enough to understand the weight of what he is participating in and has decided that understanding it does not require him to stop. Death by hanging. Thursday morning, the word moved through the courtroom like a current. Among the white landowners, a murmur, mostly relief, some satisfaction, some quieter registers that defied easy naming. Among the people at the edges of the gallery, the silence that precedes the silence that comes after. The silence of people who have been carrying the knowledge of how this ends since before it began. Eleanor Sutton, at the back, pressed her handkerchief against her lips and closed her eyes. Mrs. Marsh, beside her, gripped her hand so hard it hurt. Neither of them made a sound. There was nothing to say that the silence did not already contain. The 5 days between the verdict and the execution were ordinary days, which was perhaps the worst thing about them. The sun rose and set. The fields continued their waiting. The cotton would need to be planted again in the spring. The world moved through its routines as if nothing were different, because for most of the world within reach of that courthouse, nothing was different. 3 men sat in a county jail. And the rest of the world had its days. Reverend Pike visited on Monday and Wednesday. He was a man genuinely divided. Not bad, not dishonest, but caught in the way that many people in that time and place were caught, between what his conscience registered and what the structures his conscience lived inside required. He read scripture. He prayed. Elijah received this with courtesy. He had his own relationship to scripture, constructed over decades of reading it in solitude. And it was not the relationship Pike assumed, but it was his, and it was real, and he did not need to explain it to anyone. On the Wednesday evening after Pike left, Elijah sat with his back against the jail wall and talked. He did not talk about what was coming. He talked about what had existed. He described the cabin at night, the scratch of letters in the dirt, with the particular quality of the hour after everyone else had gone to sleep, when the day's lesson settled into the mind and you could feel it becoming permanent. He described the oak tree, the women who had crossed a fence in the dark because they needed something that their world had decided they didn't deserve to need. He described Thomas's face on the first night, the way he had touched the letters of his own name with his fingertip. He described these things not as a man eulogizing something lost. He described them the way a man describes something he built that will outlast him, which requires no grief and no ceremony, only precision, only honesty about what was made and why it mattered and what it was going to do after he was no longer there to watch it. Thomas listened without moving. Ezekiel listened with his eyes on the ceiling. Then they lay down and the night passed over them. Thursday morning arrived the way it had to. Not with drama, but with the plain insistence of a day that has its business to complete. The crowd had gathered before dawn, larger than the official machinery had expected. They stood in their formations, the landowners at the front, the townsmen behind them, and at the edges, quiet, motionless, watching, the people who had come to bear witness. Because bearing witness is its own kind of work. It is the refusal to let what is happening dissolve into the unmarked silence where difficult history goes to be forgotten. It is an act of preservation performed by the body's presence. You stand there. You see it. You carry it forward. Eleanor Sutton stood with 3 other women at the rear of the assembly. None of them had slept. They had gathered at Eleanor's house before dawn without planning to, drawn by the same thing that draws people together when what is approaching is too large for solitude. They stood close together in the gray morning air and did not speak much. There was very little that language could hold at that moment. What they were feeling was not simple. It was not only grief, not only guilt, not only the particular helplessness of people who understood exactly what was being lost and had not been able to stop it. It was all of those things layered over and through each other, and underneath all of them, something else, something they had no word for yet. The specific gravity of having been taught by someone who believed you were capable of more than the world had told you, and knowing now what that belief had cost. The pine platform smelled of new wood. The 3 ropes hung perfectly still in the windless morning. Ezekiel went first. He walked without hesitation, which was its own kind of statement. He was 51 years old. He had learned to read at 48. He stood on the platform and looked out at the county assembled before him, not at any individual face, but at the whole of it. And his expression was composed in the way of a man who has arrived at the end of a journey and is at peace with the distance he covered. Several people who were there, describing the morning decades later, said that Ezekiel's expression disturbed them more than his death did, because it was not fear, and it was not defiance. It was something they did not have a name for that unsettled them long after everything else about that morning had faded. And Thomas was 24 years old, and he shook and did not stop shaking And there was no shame in that. The body knows what the mind has accepted and responds honestly to it, and there is more dignity in honest trembling than in performed composure. He looked at the last over the heads of the assembled county in the direction of the Hargrove property, in the direction of the eastern cabin where he had first sat in the dark and learned the shape of his own name. His lips moved. Those close enough to see his face said afterward that whatever was on it in those final seconds was not despair. They could not agree on what it was, but it was not despair. And then Elijah. He came last, and he came with everything he had always brought to the moments that mattered most. The quality of absolute and deliberate presence, not resignation, not defeat, not the performance of bravery, which requires the suppression of fear. Something quieter and more complete, the presence of a man who has done what he came to do and knows it and is at peace with the knowing. He walked onto the platform and he stood and he looked out at the crowd. He looked at the landowners in the front. He looked at the townsmen. He looked at the people at the edges who had come to carry this forward. He looked at the white women at the back with their handkerchiefs and their complicated grief. His gaze moved across all of it with the same patient, receiving quality that had made him who he was. The quality of a mind that takes in what is before it without flinching, because flinching means closing, and closing means missing something. And he had never in his life been willing to miss something. Reverend Pike began the prayer. His voice was unsteady. He read from the 23rd Psalm. When Pike finished, a silence fell over the assembly, and in that silence, Elijah Calhoun smiled. Not a large smile. Not a performance of triumph or defiance. A small, composed, entirely unmistakable expression. The expression of a man who has understood something and is satisfied with the understanding. Like a teacher closing a lesson that has gone exactly as it should. Like a man reaching the final line of a proof he has been working on for a very long time and finding that it holds. Complete, correct, true. Aldous Crane, standing near the front, saw the smile. He looked at it for 2 seconds and then turned away. He never in the years that followed spoke about what he had seen. But those who knew him in his later life reported that he was a man who had lost something. Not something he could name, but something in the vicinity of certainty. Something in the vicinity of the confidence that the order of things was as natural and permanent as he had always believed. The morning completed itself. The silence that followed lasted days on the Hargrove plantation. Webb watched the people in the fields and saw what he expected to see. The surface compliance of people moving through their required work. No visible grief. No breach of routine. They did exactly what they were supposed to do, in the exact order they were supposed to do it. But in the eastern cabin, in the hour between the end of the day's labor and Webb's final rounds, things happened that Webb did not see. People gathered, not to be taught. The teacher was gone, but to do what people do when they have lost something they cannot afford to lose and need to hold its shape in the space the absence has left. They sat together in the dark and they practiced. They traced letters in the dirt the way Elijah had on the first night. They drilled sounds with each other, the older students helping the newer ones, and the newer ones helping the oldest. Naomi sat in the corner and corrected quietly, without ceremony, the way Elijah had corrected, clearly, specifically, without cruelty. Thomas was dead. Ezekiel was dead. But 9 others who had sat in that cabin were not dead. And in them, the letters lived in the body the way Elijah had said they would. Not as something that could be confiscated or forbidden or erased, but as something that had become part of the physical structure of who they were. You could take the teacher. You could not take the teaching. The knowledge moved, imperfectly, without the structure of Elijah's instruction, more slowly, But it moved. It moved from the eastern cabin to the adjoining Sutton property through the invisible communication network that connected people across that county. It moved from the Hargrove Plantation to the farms in the eastern part of the county, carried by the two free black tradesmen who had attended the later lessons. It moved in fragments, in whispers, in the scratch of letters on the inside of a barn wall that nobody but the person who made them could read. Because that is what knowledge does. It does not submit to containment. You can build a law against it. You can build a scaffold against it. You can build an entire system of enforced ignorance around it and maintain that system for generations and hire overseers to watch for any sign of its persistence. And the moment you look away, it moves because it belongs to the people who carry it and not to the people who are trying to stop it. It always has. It always will. Eleanor Sutton married in 1851 and moved to Savannah and lived for the rest of her long life in a world that looked from the outside exactly like the world she had been born into. She attended the appropriate social functions. She wore the appropriate clothes. She fulfilled the appropriate obligations. She was, in every visible respect, the woman her world had made her, but she taught quietly, carefully, over 4 decades. She taught her own children first, and with a rigor that surprised them and alarmed her husband initially before he understood that the children were thriving under it. She taught the children of women she trusted. She taught those women themselves in the evenings in private, with the same precision she had absorbed at an oak tree in Georgia from a man who had held her to a standard because he believed she could meet it. She did not teach with gentleness in the place of rigor. She had learned the difference between those two things from the best teacher she had ever had, and she honored his example by maintaining the distinction. She kept all her life a single sheet of paper. It was worn soft from decades of handling, the ink faded but legible. It contained a mathematical proof, the first complete exercise Elijah had assigned her. Hy returned to her with corrections in his hand and notes in the margin. Notes that said things like, "The logic here is sound, but the demonstration is incomplete, and the reader should not have to supply the missing step themselves. And this is better. And now it holds." She never showed it to anyone. When she died in 1887, her daughter found it folded inside a Bible and could not identify the handwriting and did not know what the document was, or who had made the notes, or what it had cost the man who made them to write them down. But she kept it, because her mother had kept it, and the things a careful woman keeps without explanation are worth keeping without knowing why. Josiah Webb left the Hargrove property in the fall of 1849. He gave no reason. He took work on a property in Alabama and was not spoken of in that county again. People who encountered him in Alabama in later years said he was changed in ways they could not specify, quieter, less settled in the authority he had once occupied without apparent question, less certain, as if something he had relied on to organize the world had been removed, and he had not yet found a replacement. Colonel Hargrove died in 1856. His son Clement sold the property 2 years later and moved to Atlanta to work as a newspaper editor. In the 1870s, he published a brief memoir of his youth on the plantation that mentioned, in oblique and careful language, certain events which had caused him, as a young man, to question his assumptions about the nature of intelligence and the nature of justice. He named no one. He described nothing directly. But the shape of what he was trying to say was visible in the gaps of what he could not bring himself to say fully. The oak tree at the eastern property line is still standing. It is very old now, patient in the way of things that have outlasted everything that happened around them. If you stood beneath it on a quiet evening and knew what you were looking for, knew where to look and in what light and at what angle, you might still find in the bark the traces of letters, scratched years ago by people sitting in a Georgia night, learning what their names looked like in writing. Time has worked on them. Weather has worked on them. They are faint, but they are there. Here is what the execution of Elijah Calhoun tells us about the world that produced it. And the men who built that scaffold understood something that they rarely admitted in polite company. The entire structure of the world they had constructed depended, at its foundation, not on the physical chains, but on a particular management of the mind. Knowledge was not an amenity they had chosen to withhold. It was the keystone. Remove it, and the arch comes down. They knew this. The 1829 statute was not written by ignorant men. It was written by men who understood exactly what they were doing and why it was necessary, and who chose with clear eyes to do it anyway. Which means that what Elijah Calhoun did, teaching in a dark cabin at terrible personal risk, holding white women to standards their own academies had decided they were not capable of meeting, building an education that crossed every line that power had drawn, was not a small rebellion. It was an act that went directly at the thing the entire system depended on most. It was an attack on the keystone, and the system responded accordingly. He knew this from the beginning. He knew it from the night he sat outside the eastern cabin with a piece of wood in his hands and decided that patience had run its course. He was not naive. He was not reckless. He was a man who had spent 30 years building something in the interior of his own mind and had decided finally that it was time to let it out into the world, at whatever cost. The cost was everything, and he paid it with a composed, small, unmistakable smile on a pine platform on a Thursday morning, in front of the entire assembled weight of the county that had decided to stop him, and it did not stop him, because the thing he built did not die. It moved. It moved through 9 students in a plantation cabin, through the careful teaching of a woman who lived a life that looked entirely ordinary from the outside, through the letters scratched in an oak tree's bark, through the finger of a 6-year-old girl tracing shapes in the dust that she did not yet know were the shapes of a language. It moved and it kept moving in the way that all true things move when someone has had the courage to put them into the world, quietly, persistently, impossible to fully stop. That is the story of Elijah Calhoun, and I want to know what it did to you. Leave me a comment. Tell me the moment in this story that stopped you. The ledger, the first lesson, the fence, the oak tree, the smile. Tell me where in the world you're watching from. These stories reach people on 6 continents, and I read every single comment because that is how I know this work matters and should keep going. If you are not subscribed, do it now. Hit the notification bell so you do not miss what is coming next. Share this video with one person who you think needs to hear a story about what education costs and what it is worth and why there have always been human beings willing to pay both prices at once. We will be back with another forgotten story very soon.